This episode contains graphic content that may not be suitable for all ages. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, help is available. Call or text 988 or chat with someone at 988lifeline.org. Those outside of the US, reach out to someone at your local crisis center or hotline. Please do not suffer in silence. April 1984. On the remote shores of Horseshoe Lake, 200 miles north of Anchorage, Alaska state troopers, guided by Robert Hansen's confession, stumbled upon a grave hidden in the wilderness. There, they found a shallow burial site where the body of a young woman had lain for over a year. There were no personal belongings, no clues to her identity, just scattered bones, fragments of clothing, and the haunting reality of yet another victim of Robert Hansen's terror. At first, she was just another nameless Jane Doe, buried under the grim nickname Horseshoe Harriet, after the lake where her body was found. Despite the chilling details of Hansen's confession and the precise location of her grave, no one knew who she was. Hansen had taken her life, but refused to give her a name, leaving behind only the cold certainty of murder. For decades, this young woman remained a mystery. Though authorities knew her killer, they could not identify the young woman. There were no missing persons reports that matched, and without a name, her story remained suspended in time. Most of Hansen's other victims were buried, named, and given closure, but Horseshoe Harriet was lost to the void. It wasn't until 2021, nearly 4 decades later, that modern forensic technology, genetic genealogy to be specific, finally gave her back her name. The woman once known as Horseshoe Harriet was finally identified as Robin Pelkey, a 19-year-old from Colorado who had disappeared in Anchorage in 1983, just before Robert Hansen was arrested. After all those years, she was no longer another anonymous victim. But as Robin Pelkey's identity came to light, the questions did not stop there. You see, while Robert Hansen's crimes have been mostly uncovered, there are still missing victims, unsolved cases, and haunting ambiguities that remain. Hansen's death in 2014 did not close the door on all of his crimes. Some names are still missing, and some remains are still out there, waiting to be found. This is the story of the Butcher Baker. Part 4. Unfinished. After his February 1984 plea bargain and sentencing, Robert Hansen disappeared from public view, swallowed by the American justice system. He had confessed to the brutal murders of 17 women and the rape of 30 others, receiving 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole. In a strategic move to avoid a spectacle of endless trials, prosecutors only formally charged him with 4 of the murders. Those of Sherry Morrow, Joanna Messina, Eklutna Annie, and Paula Golding, in exchange for his full cooperation. Hansen had agreed to this deal on the condition he serve his time out of state and that there be no publicity in the press about him. For the moment, the man now known as the Butcher Baker wanted to vanish. And vanish he did, for a while. Hansen was initially remanded to the United States Penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, far from the Alaskan community whose trust he had betrayed. In the confines of a federal prison, he was just another lifer with no name, no bakery, and no hunting ground. His notoriety meant little there. He reportedly kept a low profile. For 4 years, the man who had once stalked the frozen Alaska wilds now paced in a concrete cage. In 1988, Alaska quietly brought Robert Hansen back. Having secured the conviction and with the media furor calming, officials transferred him to Lemon Creek Correctional Facility in Juneau briefly, and then to the Spring Creek Correctional Center in Seward, Alaska, the state's only maximum security prison. Spring Creek, nestled in a remote coastal valley, became Hansen's home for the next quarter century. Surrounded by razor wire and towering mountains, he could see the raw wilderness beyond the prison walls. The wilderness where he had once tried to become the apex predator, but he would never get to venture out into it ever again. Inside, Robert Hansen was an inmate in a system of hundreds. He was an odd figure among the prison population, slight of build, soft-spoken, and known to be a former baker and family man turned serial killer. Prosecutor Frank Rothschild remembered of seeing Hansen during the trial, noting how unimposing he seemed at first glance. He was a small guy, a little mild-mannered sort of fellow. In prison, Hansen's mild demeanor persisted. Fellow inmates knew of his infamy, the quote-unquote butcher baker who hunted women. But by most accounts, he did not boast or cause trouble on the cell block. He was no alpha predator behind bars. He just did his time quietly. Guards and inmates alike observed that Robert Hansen rarely spoke of his crimes. In fact, he rarely spoke at all. Decades earlier, an evaluating psychiatrist had described Hansen as having an infantile personality fueled by resentment. But in captivity, that rage seemed contained. He worked routine prison jobs, avoided fights, and faded into the background. One can imagine the bitter irony, and maybe take a little pleasure in it. A man who had exerted ultimate control over his victims now controlled nothing in his daily life, following prison schedules and orders like any other convict. For years, Hansen had no visitors beyond the occasional attorney or investigator. His wife, Darla, had divorced him soon after his arrest. She and their 2 children changed their names and disappeared into anonymity, having learned the horrific double life of the husband and father they once trusted and loved. Hansen's own parents had passed away in the 1980s. He had no remaining family willing to go see him. Inmates say he spent his free hours reading, perhaps the Bible or mystery novels, and tending to some small hobbies. Some convicts at Spring Creek took up painting or woodworking, though it's unclear if Hansen ever did. If the memories of his crimes haunted him at night, he never shared it with anyone. Remorse never came. Hansen granted no interviews to the media during his incarceration, maintaining the press silence he had bargained for. The world largely forgot about him for a time, even as Hollywood produced a film in 2013 about his case, the aptly named Frozen Ground, starring Nicolas Cage and John Cusack. It's surprisingly pretty good. But Robert Hansen, true to form, stayed silent. But there was one place where Hansen had to speak, in his debriefings with investigators. As part of his plea deal, he was obligated to help authorities locate his victims' remains and explain the fates of the missing. In 1984, shortly after his conviction, Hansen was flown in handcuffs over the Alaskan wilderness he once prowled, pointing out marked grave sites on a map he had drawn. In total, Hansen pointed out 17 grave sites scattered in the remote reaches of south-central Alaska, grisly landmarks of his killing spree. The police were stunned. 12 of those sites were revelations, previously unknown to investigators. With Hansen's guidance, recovery teams exhumed as many bodies as they could. 12 victims' remains were ultimately found and returned to their families, but 5 sites yielded no bodies, either because the remains had been scattered by animals or were too well hidden. Hansen coldly confirmed the police theories of how he abducted and killed these women, adding some chilling details. Sometimes he would even let a potential victim go if she convinced him she would not report him to police. He admitted that he began killing in the early 1970s, earlier than authorities had suspected. Yet, even as he cooperated, Hansen held back. Investigators noticed several X marks on his personal aviation map that Hansen refused to address, including 3 marks in Resurrection Bay near Seward. These were ominous gaps in his story. By the terms of his deal, Hansen had to confess to the 17 known murders, but nothing forced him to volunteer information about other potential victims. Authorities suspected those 3 mystery marks corresponded to at least 2 missing women from Seward, Mary Thill and Megan Emmerich. Hansen denied killing them, but his map suggested otherwise. Even confronted with the evidence of the marks, he would not budge. In one interview session, as prosecutors presented Hansen with his own marked map, they saw his true nature flare up. Frank Rothschild recalled of that moment, describing how Hansen suddenly erupted in anger and had to step away, screaming at his lawyers in frustration. He transformed, his face turned red and the hair stood up on the back of his neck. He got really upset. Robert Hansen knew what those extra marks on the map meant, but he took those answers back to his cell, sealed behind a tight grin. It seemed like a few secrets would remain his. For decades, Robert Hansen lived the monotonous life of a prisoner. Only occasional flashes of news reminded the public that the butcher baker was still alive behind bars. An appeal filed and denied here, a mention in a documentary there. He aged into his 70s, reportedly with declining health in his final years. In early 2014, Hansen's condition worsened. The Alaska Department of Corrections quietly transferred him from Spring Creek to the Anchorage Correctional Complex's medical unit on May 11th. By summer, the once prowling hunter was frail, suffering from lingering conditions of age. The exact ailments were never made public, but officials referred to natural causes and lingering health issues, likely things like heart disease or diabetes, the mundane killers that time inflicts. On August 21st, 2014, Robert Hansen died after slipping into declining health for about a year. He took his last breath in a hospital bed, under guard, alone. The news of Robert Hansen's death reverberated briefly through Alaska. Families of victims noted the grim milestone. Investigators like Glenn Flota, who had devoted years to stopping Hansen, voiced relief that the world is better without him. Frank Rothschild, speaking from retirement, admitted a vindictive satisfaction. He's one of those guys you hope every breath he takes in life there's some pain because he caused such pain. In the end, Hansen had spent 30 years imprisoned, far less than his 461-year term, but long enough that he never saw freedom again. His body was reportedly cremated with little ceremony. There was no public memorial, no grieving crowds. Robert Hansen's story could have ended there, tied up with the neat bow of justice. The serial murderer lived out his days in a cell and died in shame, alone. Case closed, except it wasn't. One mystery that Robert Hansen left behind is as poignant as it is troubling: the identity of his first known murder victim, a young woman known only by the nickname Eklutna Annie. The body of the young woman known to us as Eklutna Annie was found back in July 1980 in a quiet wooded area near Eklutna Lake Road, roughly 20 miles north of Anchorage. Her body was discovered in a shallow grave by some construction workers, having decomposed significantly and been partially scavenged by wildlife. Authorities exhumed all they could find at the site: bones, fragments of clothing, a few pieces of jewelry. There was no identification. Due to the location she was found, investigators gave her the placeholder name Eklutna Annie. That name would stick. An autopsy determined the woman had been killed by a single stab wound to the back. She was petite, about 5 feet tall, likely in her late teens or early 20s. Crucially, this was July 1980, 3 years before Robert Hansen was caught. At the time, police did not know who had killed her. Eklutna Annie became a Jane Doe case, and despite efforts, no missing persons report matched her description. It was only after Hansen's arrest in 1983 that he admitted to murdering this young woman. During his confession, Hansen said she was probably either a topless dancer or a prostitute he had picked up in Anchorage, and he claimed she was his first murder victim. He recounted picking her up downtown and telling her that he would take her to his home. When she realized he was lying and driving her out of the city, she panicked. She begged him to turn back. Hansen pretended to oblige, but instead drove deeper into the woods along a power line trail. The girl tried to escape his car, and in that desperate moment, Hansen stabbed her in the back as she fled, killing her. He buried her hastily in the lonely spot where those workmen would later stumble upon her bones. Hansen recalled a few other details: that the young woman wore blue jeans, a sweater, and a brown leather jacket, which matched what was found at the scene. He could not remember her name and claimed he wasn't sure if she was a dancer or a sex worker. Hansen thought she might have been from Kodiak, Alaska, though investigators suspected she may have come from California, like many others during the pipeline boom. None of this gave her an identity. Hansen certainly did not know, or care to know, who she really was. And so, decades passed without a name for Eklutna Annie. She was buried in Anchorage Memorial Park Cemetery under a small marker that simply reads, Jane Doe, died 1980. Imagine that, an entire life distilled to an anonymous grave and a year. For investigators, this was an open wound. This young woman deserved a name, a story, a family to claim her. She deserved, as one advocate later said, just as much of a search for her people as any other victim, as any other survivor. Eklutna Annie's plight highlights how society failed to notice someone like her in life. No one seemingly reported her missing in a way that could be traced. If she had family, they never knew where she disappeared to. In death, she nearly became lost in a file of unsolved cases. But in Alaska, people did not forget Eklutna Annie. Over the years, numerous efforts were made to identify her. Forensic artists created several facial reconstructions of what she may have looked like. In the 1980s, a clay-sculpted bust of her face was made from her skull. Later, digital recreations were done, one by the FBI in the early 2000s and another by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in 2013. Each time her image, a pretty young woman with high cheekbones and a tentative smile, was circulated in the media, hoping someone would recognize her. Leads came in, but none of them seemed to ring true. Dozens of missing women were compared against her remains. We know who she isn't. Authorities have ruled out at least 4 other missing women, Roxanne Eastland, Karen Even, Megan Emmerich, and Teresa Davis, as possibilities for Eklutna Annie. Yet her true identity remains elusive. While decades have passed, the case has not gone cold in the hearts of the cold case detectives. In fact, in the last few years, science has seemingly offered some new hope. By 2020, investigators turned to genetic genealogy, the same method that caught the Golden State Killer, to finally put a name to Eklutna Annie. They exhumed her remains and generated a DNA profile, uploading it to genealogical databases. In 2021, this cutting-edge effort succeeded in identifying another of Hansen's previously unnamed victims, Horseshoe Harriet, who we touched on in the intro. But as of this recording, Eklutna Annie is the last of Hansen's victims who remains unidentified. The Alaska Bureau of Investigation is actively working her case even now, using every modern DNA technique available. Each year that passes without answers is painful, but there is determination. As advocate Autumn Smith puts it, identifying Eklutna Annie means that no matter how you lived, even after death, there is an equality here. She deserves just as much of a search for her people as any other victim. Eklutna Annie may have been a sex worker or a dancer, vulnerable and far from home, but she was someone's daughter, someone's friend. Her life had value. Society owes this young woman her identity, even decades after her death. Eklutna Annie, at least, was found, but several of Hansen's confessed victims have never been found at all. These women are supposedly still out there in the Alaskan wilderness, their remains unrecovered, leaving families without closure and graves without bodies. By Hansen's own admission, he murdered 17 women, and as we've touched on, only 12 were ever located. That leaves 5 who remain missing to this day, despite Hansen's confessions. Who were these lost victims, and what happened to them? There was Roxanne Eastland, 24 years old. Roxanne was last seen in Anchorage on June 28, 1980. She had been staying at a motel on Anchorage's 4th Avenue with her boyfriend, working as a dancer. That day she planned to meet a man downtown. She vanished without a trace. Years later, Hansen admitted he picked up Roxanne Eastland and killed her, though he did not or could not lead authorities to her body. Her remains have never been discovered. Whether Hansen buried her in a grave that has yet to be found, or whether animals scattered her bones, remains unknown. All we have is his chilling confession and the sorrow of her family, who have waited years for answers. Then there's Andrea Fish Altieri, also 24. Andrea was an exotic dancer who disappeared on December 2nd, 1981. She was last seen getting into a taxi, heading to meet a man at a downtown Anchorage club for a supposed photo shoot. She never returned. In Hansen's confession, he provided some ghastly detail. After abducting and sexually assaulting Andrea Altieri, he tied a metal weight to her body and threw her off a bridge into the Knik River. Andrea's body was never found. lost in the silty depths of the river or swept out to sea. When police searched Hansen's home, they found a fish-shaped necklace that belonged to Andrea, a trophy he had kept. That necklace helped confirm her fate, but her physical remains have never been recovered. Her family was left to presume her death without the comfort of burying her. In the case of Andrea Fish Altieri, Robert Hansen weighted her down and consigned her to the depths of the Knik Arm. It was an act of final control. Even in death, he sought to erase evidence of her existence. That is the cruelty that we as society have grappled with. These women did not just lose their lives, they almost lost any record of their death. Only Hansen's confession kept their memories from being completely lost. For the families of Roxanne and Andrea in particular, there has been no closure, just the painful knowledge from Hansen's own mouth that their daughter or sister was murdered without a grave to mourn at. Investigators have not entirely given up on finding remains where possible. Over the years, there have been renewed searches when technology or tips allowed. In 1989, for example, a map drawn by Robert Hansen, or by someone he told in prison, hinted at a possible gravesite on the Kenai Peninsula. This sparked a search for the body of Megan Emmerich, we'll get to her in a moment, by law enforcement and volunteers, though nothing was found. Even today, if hikers or construction crews stumble upon human remains in the wilderness around Anchorage, troopers quietly check against Hansen's missing victims list. For now, however, those lost victims remain out there, under the snow and moss, and Hansen, who could have definitively helped locate them, chose to stay silent on certain details. In doing so, he maintained one last bit of power, keeping the full truth of their fates known only to himself. Something that was absolutely infuriating to investigators like Glenn Flota. As Flota said years after the case, even though Hansen was already behind bars, those missing women were still on my list. He never stopped considering it his mission to find them. The fact that he couldn't remained a source of sadness and anger for him. Were there more victims than the 17 Hansen confessed to? This question has loomed for decades. Investigators and experts have long suspected that Hansen's real body count might be higher, possibly 21 or more. The evidence is disturbing. Unexplained marks on Hansen's kill map, unsolved cases that fit his MO, and even prison cellmate rumors of additional confessions. From the start, when Hansen finally cracked and detailed his crimes in 1984, law enforcement noted a discrepancy. On Hansen's aviation map, on which he had marked burial sites, there were a few more X's than the 17 he acknowledged. Troopers counted at least 21 marks in total. Hansen accounted for 17 of them, which corresponded to the 17 murders he admitted, but that left 4 marks unexplained. When pressed, Hansen either denied involvement or simply refused to talk about those locations. So let's first touch upon Celia Van Zanten, also known as Beth Van Zanten, who was 18 years old. Celia was a young woman who vanished on December 22, 1971 in Anchorage, which would make it very early in Hansen's timeline. She left her house to buy soda and never returned. 3 days later, on Christmas 1971, her body was found in the snow at McHugh Creek in Chugach State Park on the outskirts of Anchorage. She had been bound, sexually assaulted, and slashed with a knife, and ultimately died of exposure after attempting to crawl out of a ravine. Crucially, this was a year before Hansen's first official murders. At the time, no one connected it to him, but years later, when Hansen's map was studied, investigators noticed an X near where Celia's body had been found. This raised strong suspicion that Hansen was her killer. Hansen, however, denied killing Celia Van Zanten to police. It's possible he did not want to admit to an earlier, clumsier crime. After all, Celia was not a sex worker, and her death did not fit the pattern he later established. Maybe he truly wasn't the killer, but most investigators believed that his map did not lie. The tragedy is that without a confession or additional evidence, Celia's murder remains officially unsolved. If Hansen was responsible, she would be his earliest known murder victim. Then there's 17-year-old Megan Siobhan Emmerich. Megan was a teenager who disappeared on July 7, 1973 from the seaside town of Seward. She was last seen leaving the laundry room of her vocational school dormitory and simply vanished. No trace of her has ever been found. Hansen denied killing Megan Emmerich when questioned, but evidence suggests otherwise. Hansen had a boat and happened to be in Seward around the 4th of July in 1973, the same time that Megan Emmerich went missing. On that mysterious map of his, there was indeed an X mark on the Kenai Peninsula near Seward. Years after Hansen's conviction, 2 incarcerated men who had been Hansen's cellmates at Spring Creek claimed that Hansen confessed to them about Megan Emmerich. According to one of these inmates, Hansen said he had taken Megan out to a remote cabin accessible only by boat, murdered her, and hidden her body there. In 2008, this rumor prompted a fresh investigation. Alaska State Troopers and even the FBI became involved in trying to verify the inmate's claims. A witness from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children found the inmate's information credible and considered it good info. There was even talk of a copy of Hansen's hidden map showing Megan's grave. However, searches did not yield Megan's body, and Hansen himself, when confronted in prison, continued to deny it. Still, retired trooper Glenn Flota said flatly that if he were still on the case, Megan Emmerich and another victim, Mary Thill, would still be on his list of possible victims. The latter of those 2 names, Mary Kathleen Thill, was a 22-year-old who vanished from Seward on July 5, 1975, almost exactly 2 years after Megan Emmerich. She was last seen heading toward a waterfall just outside of town. Like Megan Emmerich, Mary's remains have never been found. Hansen also denied killing Mary Thill, but again there was an X on his map near Resurrection Bay in Seward. In fact, there were 3 X's around Resurrection Bay, and authorities believe that at least 2 correspond to Mary Thill and Megan Emmerich. The same inmates who spoke of Megan said Hansen also admitted to killing Mary and throwing her body in the deep waters of Resurrection Bay. If that's true, Mary's body may rest on the ocean floor. In 1975, her disappearance was a mystery. In hindsight, she fits the profile of an early Hansen victim. Though she was not a dancer or a sex worker of any kind, she was a local woman who perhaps caught Hansen's eye. Her case too remains unsolved and officially separate from Hansen's ledger, but investigators strongly suspect his involvement. These 3 cases, Celia Van Zanten, Megan Siobhan Emmerich, and Mary Kathleen Thill, are the most prominent potential Hansen victims beyond the 17 that are known. If Hansen killed them, his total count would be at least 20, possibly even more. It's chilling to think that there could be others even beyond these. Hansen was active from about 1971 to 1983. In his early years, before he honed in his victim profile, there may have been crimes that went under the radar or were even blamed on others. For instance, Celia Van Zanten's murder in 1971 was initially not linked to any suspect. Only hindsight pointed to Robert Hansen. Are there other unsolved cases from that era that might tie back to him? Some experts have speculated about a few missing women in the late 1970s that might fit, but no concrete evidence has ever emerged. What we do know is that Robert Hansen himself cultivated ambiguity. In his 1984 confession, Hansen admitted what the police could prove and what he thought would satisfy the deal. No more, no less. He had negotiated for no public trial and minimal publicity, and likely he wanted to keep certain crimes off the record, perhaps to spare himself any additional infamy or simply out of stubborn pride. Investigators noted at the time that Hansen seemed to enjoy holding back some information. One could sense that he liked having a few secrets left. There's also a practical aspect to all of this. Any murders Hansen denied could not be closed, and thus left a sliver of doubt. Hansen may have hoped that by not confessing to certain early murders, like Celia's, he would avoid tarnishing his own twisted self-image. In his mind, he seemingly focused on prostitutes and dancers. If he had killed an innocent teenage girl in 1971, maybe while he was on vacation with his family, that broke the pattern and might have made him look more like a reckless killer than the methodical hunter he fancied himself to be. This is speculative psychology, of course, but not far-fetched. Serial offenders often rationalize or reframe their crimes. Hansen was known to blame his victims at times and justify his actions, such as when he referred to them as bad girls, stuff like that. Even in prison, Hansen occasionally hinted at things but never fully spilled. The reports of him confiding in cellmates like Manfred West and Kenneth Gage, the 2 inmates from 2008, show that he might have dropped partial truths, possibly for bragging rights or out of boredom. But when those inmates tried to leverage that info for their own benefit, one demanded freedom in exchange for the map he copied from Hansen's hints. The full story became muddled. Hansen was capable of lying to other criminals as much as he lied to authorities. As author Leland Hale mused, Hansen could have easily lied to the cons about Emmerich and Phil just to toy with them or to elevate his own dark legend. However, Alaska State Troopers treat every hint seriously. They did back in 2008, and they still do today. The possibility of more victims means the case is technically open-ended. In official records, Hansen is suspected in up to 21 or more murders, even though only 17 are confirmed, and he was only ever convicted for 4. It's a remarkable and troubling thing. Even after all these years, we can't say with certainty that we know the full scope of Robert Hansen's crimes. This lingering uncertainty is, in part, a testament to the era in which Hansen operated. The 1970s and early 80s in Anchorage were a chaotic time. Sex workers, dancers, drifters, they came and went, often without anyone keeping close track. Sudden disappearances were commonplace in that scene. Hansen learned to exploit that. As Frank Rothschild explained, Anchorage at the time was perfect for someone like Robert Hansen. His victims were mostly runaways who had no family support. For many, Anchorage was a place to make money and survive. In other words, the community and police weren't watching out for these women the way they would have for, say, a well-to-do suburban housewife. Hansen himself eventually acknowledged this, telling investigators that he deliberately learned he needed to take women who weren't easily believed or cared about by the community or police. Or as Trooper Flota put it bluntly, Hansen figured out that strippers and sex workers were harder to track and less likely to be missed. Those words sting. Less likely to be missed. The implication is that our society failed to miss them, failed to notice when they were just gone. Robert Hansen's killing spree was facilitated by systemic apathy. Early on, when some of these women went missing, there was no big search party, there were no headlines. Law enforcement, strapped and perhaps biased by the victims' lifestyles, did not pour resources into finding them. That allowed a predator like Robert Hansen to continue, relatively unchecked, for about a decade. Even Cindy Paulson, the 17-year-old who miraculously escaped Hansen in 1983 and sounded the alarm, was at first not fully believed by authorities. An APD officer initially dismissed parts of her story. After all, she was a teenage sex worker, and Hansen was a mild-mannered local businessman with a family. It took persistence by Alaska State Trooper Glenn Flota and others to dig deeper, to trust Cindy's account, and to break the case open. How many others might have tried to escape or sought help, only to be doubted or ignored by those they trusted? This is where our anger at the system comes in. Because yes, we should be angry. At Robert Hansen, undoubtedly, but also at the circumstances that allowed him to prey on these women so freely. The haunting possibility of more victims, unidentified victims, and untold stories is a direct result of how society viewed these women. They were often seen as less than, as transient, as trouble, and Hansen knew that. He weaponized society's neglect against his victims. August 21st, 2014, Alaska Regional Hospital, Anchorage. The fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow on a frail 75-year-old man lying restrained by tubes and wires. The heart monitor beeps steadily at first, then begins to stutter. In the hallway, a corrections officer shifts nervously. Robert Hansen, Alaska's most notorious serial killer, is taking his final breaths. Nurses rush in as the alarm sound. Moments later, the monitor flatlines. A doctor checks for a pulse, then quietly notes the time. 1:30 a.m. The officer steps outside and speaks into his radio. Robert Hansen is dead. Word travels fast through official channels. Glenn Flota, the retired state trooper who spent years hunting Hansen, offers only one thought to the press that morning. On this day, we should only remember his many victims and all of their families. As far as Hansen is concerned, this world is better without him. Hearing of Hansen's death, former prosecutor Frank Rothschild does not mince his words either. He will not be missed. Good riddance to him. "30+ years after Robert Hansen's reign of terror ended, his story remains a cautionary tale, not only of the darkness one human being can harbor, but of the cost of indifference toward the vulnerable. Hansen died in a prison hospital bed, but the aftermath of his crimes is far from over. When we reflect on Hansen's final years and the mysteries that persist, there is an uneasy realization that some justice is yet incomplete. True, Robert Hansen faced earthly justice. He was imprisoned until his final breath, condemned in 1984 so that he could never hurt another soul. But for his victims and their families, justice includes remembering their names, telling their stories, and, when possible, finding the lost and giving them back their identity. In that sense, work remains. Eklutna Annie must get her name back. She is the last of Hansen's known victims to remain nameless. Investigators press on with modern forensic methods to identify her, refusing to let her fade into a statistic. Her unidentified status is a stark reminder of how easily a young woman's entire existence can be erased, but also a rallying cry that even 40-plus years later, we will not let that stand. The unrecovered victims deserve to be found. Even if Hansen tried to thwart discovery, the search isn't truly over. Alaska's wilderness does give up its secrets sometimes. Hikers might find a bone, erosion might uncover a shallow grave. Every so often, state troopers still get calls about possible human remains in remote areas, and they quietly check them against Hansen's missing victims list. Hope remains that one day someone might stumble upon a skull or a fragment that finally closes a case. Until then, families like those of Roxanne Eastland and Andrea Altieri live in a painful limbo. The shadow of additional victims must be acknowledged. While we may never confirm beyond doubt the fates of Megan Emmerich, Mary Thill, or others Robert Hansen likely killed, we remember their names. We acknowledge that justice did not officially reach those cases. They serve as haunting what-ifs. If only Hansen had been caught sooner. If only someone had connected the dots back in the 1970s. If only we could compel the truth from a liar's mouth. The possibility of more victims means there may be families out there who never even knew to mourn. Parents or siblings of a runaway who disappeared in 1972 or 1976, not realizing she crossed paths with a serial killer. Those families, too, were failed by the system. In the end, the story of Robert Hansen or the Butcher Baker is one of contrast. On one hand, it's a story of incredible police work and survival. Brave young Cindy Paulson escaping and insisting her story be heard. Dogged investigators like Glenn Floda and prosecutors like Frank Rothschild piecing together clues and bringing Hansen down. The community's outrage pushing for justice for women who were often marginalized. On the other hand, it's a story of society failing. How easy it was for Robert Hansen to get away with what he did for so long because his victims were women on the fringes. Women he correctly assumed the world would not rally to find. Hansen's crimes provoke outrage not just for their sick brutality, but for how preventable they might have been if the victims had not been so easily dismissed in life. We think of the 17-year-old dancer turned informant who had to literally run for her life shackled in handcuffs to make the police notice. And even then, they didn't give a shit until another person, a man, validated her story. We think of how many times Robert Hansen was lightly punished for earlier offenses, like the 1971 attempted abduction and assault for which he served just a few months in prison, giving him confidence that he could continue, that he could escalate. We think of how many warnings were missed or minimized because the victims were considered troublesome or unreliable. It's okay to be pissed off in knowing that had things been different, some, if not most of these young women might still be alive. Yet from that, we must do better. Law enforcement in Alaska has evolved since the Robert Hansen era. The attitude towards missing persons, especially missing sex workers or indigenous women, has markedly changed. Each unidentified victim case now receives attention and resources that were unheard of in the 1980s, evidenced by the advanced DNA work being done for Eklutna Annie. Society too has grown, perhaps learning in part from tragedies like this, to recognize that every life, every person, matters. Robert Hansen is gone, but the responsibility of remembering falls to us. We must not remember his name with fascination, but rather the names of those he harmed. Sherry Morrow, Paula Golding, Joanna Messina, Delene Frey. Women who loved and were loved, whose lives were cut short but whose voices echoed through the brave testimony of survivors and the dedication of investigators. We speak of Eklutna Annie and Horseshoe Harriet, aka Robin Pelkey, once Jane Does, now symbols of why we never give up on a victim's story. We acknowledge those still lost in the Alaskan wild, Roxanne, Andrea, Megan, Mary, Celia, and commit that they will not be forgotten, no matter how long it takes to find them or learn their truth. The case of Robert Hansen leaves us with unanswered questions that may never be fully resolved, but it also leaves us with a sense of moral clarity. The women he targeted were human beings who deserved protection, and in many ways, the system failed them. We can't rewrite the past, but we can ensure that going forward, we see and value those on the margins, those that are different. We can ensure that predators like Robert Hansen find no dark corners to hide in, no indifferent shrug from authorities to enable them. So, let's take this story and try to fuel some positive change. Because the final chapter isn't truly about Robert Hansen at all. It's about the victims, those that were named and remain unnamed. It's about restoring dignity to those who were once deprived of it. It's about memory and justice living on, even after the monster who caused this harm is long dead. With all that being said, this story remains unresolved.